Join On the Other Hand today for this.
Students actually are reporting a reluctance to discuss controversial topics like politics, gender, and race. They're fearing those negative consequences either from peers or faculty. This is On the Other Hand, a podcast that features community leaders in Arkansas sharing their views and experiences on how to make Arkansas better.
Hello and welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm your host, Glenn White, and I'm here with my co-host, April Chatham Carpenter. As you know, on our podcast, April and I tend to interview community leaders in Arkansas who in some way are working towards solutions across various political or other divides, or in some way are just trying to make things better for Arkansans. So, April, as you know, today is different. We have no guest. What in the world are we going to do without anyone else to talk to?
Glenn, I think that we're going to talk to each other, and this has been something that you wanted to do for a while.
Yeah.
I think I've pushed back on it a little bit, but what we're going to be doing actually is something similar to what Braver Angels describes as a one-to-one conversation, although we aren't using the same format that they have on their website in case people are interested. In this case, we're doing a red-blue conversation, and we've picked a topic. So we're going to be discussing, and we'll talk about what that topic is here in a minute. But I think most people know here that we identified on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And I identify primarily as a red politically, while you identify mostly as a blue politically. And I think our parties have left us in some places, but
Yep.
We are still conservative and liberal in terms of our ideologies, primarily in many ways. In reality, over the years as we work together, we have found that we have lots of common ground in our views, but we also have some unique perspectives that our primary political identities do color, and I think that's what we're going to be trying to get at with this. In general, when people can do these one-to-one conversations, and I know I have my students do this as an assignment in my fall class that I teach on listening and civil dialogue. They tend to pick someone who's different than them, right? So red, blue, or a different generation, or a different race or ethnicity, or but the rules are that we speak only for ourselves. We're not speaking for a particular group of people, or a particular party or politician. And we try to find some things that we do have in common when we do these kinds of conversations. And so, Glenn, I know you and I kind of brainstormed some possible topic areas, and today we agreed on one that we thought might not be too controversial. We'll see. But it's free speech, and we know that that can encompass a variety of issues. So I really look forward to the conversation. So the way this is going to be laid out is that we're going to share some thoughts with each other and maybe some resources as well, but we'll mostly be trying to explore our views with each other, as well as various other perspectives of what free speech might mean and its implication for a democratic society such as ours. As always, in our podcast, we really prioritize following Braver Angels guidelines, which means that we're remaining respectful and yet honest. We might become passionate at times as we find out how we each view free speech and related issues, and that's okay. We might disagree, and we might agree. We really don't know. We have not scripted this out, Glenn. So I'm actually looking forward to learning about what we might have in common, as well as better understanding where we may have differences.
Yeah, April, it all sounds good to me. I do look forward to this conversation. There's a little bit of going into the unknown, but I have complete confidence that we're going to be able to remain respectful and to find common ground in several places. For me, I think the most interesting part is going to be finding areas where we disagree and how we're able to articulate our basis for those particular views where we differ. One of the things I want to make a point of is that in Braver Angels, some of you may know that among the other things Braver Angels does, we teach people specific communication skills. We call them LAP skills, LAPP, and that stands for listen, acknowledge, pivot and perspective. So we're not going to be stuck to that entirely, but we're going to try to use that as much as we can so that we can serve as a model for listeners on how to have good conversation skills when you're talking about difficult topics. So at this point, I said, let's not belabor this too much, but for those who might be new to us, let's talk briefly about our background in Braver Angels and our kind of life otherwise. Why don't you start?
All right. Well, thank you, Glenn. And actually, it was the communication skills or the emphasis on communication skills that drew me into Braver Angels. Initially, I really wasn't much of a person that would talk about politics. When I joined Braver Angels in 2020, right on the cusp of the COVID pandemic. But I was a college professor teaching communication classes, and conflict management being one of the areas that I like to study and do facilitation and workshops on and teaching about. So when I learned that Braver Angels was really attempting to teach people how to speak and listen better across the political divide, it made me interested in wanting to get involved. And I jumped right in, actually learning to be a moderator and of their workshops. And they have multiple workshops that they provide that are skills based and some that are engagement based in terms of, working across the divide and really trying to come up with common ground. And I've been doing that for several years now. Glenn, how about you?
Well, I'm a retired psychologist, and one of the things that I've always been interested in is what makes people tick. How do people think and decide, and sort of things like that. So, around the 2016 election, as the polarization was increasing, I was really intrigued and curious about what was going on to account for the differences we were seeing. So, I went to the research literature in the social sciences to find out. And at the same time, I found out about Braver Angels, which was a newly established organization at that time. And so I joined and helped found the alliance here in Arkansas, and have been into that ever since. I've always been a little bit interested in politics, tended to keep up with it, but I'm really interested in these other kind of psychosocial aspects that I'm talking about. So that's what's gotten me started and what keeps me going. I think it's also maybe a way to contribute to our community, which is something I think, incidentally, it would be good for everyone to find a way to contribute to the well-being of their community one way or another. So that's enough about us. Let's start off the discussion of free speech to our primary source, the U.S. Constitution. In the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, here's what it says. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So you heard it there. The Congress cannot make any law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. So that's a fairly straightforward text, it would seem, but it has been the subject of extensive interpretation and debate over the course of our country's existence. It's shaped the landscape of free speech rights and also some of the limitations that are seen as permissible on free speech. I bet every one of us has some view about free speech. What we talk about today are certainly not going to cover all those perspectives, but hopefully it'll be a reasonable coverage of some of the few key points. So let's get started. April, give us an idea of some of your initial thoughts about free speech.
Yeah, and I'm going to preface this by saying that, I'm going to actually present a conservative kind of perspective on this, but you're going to see that, none of us can be just labeled by one label. And you're going to see a lot of other influences come in from my religious faith to my work as a communication researcher and teacher. So I'm not just a conservative. I'm much more than that. I'm a woman. There's so many things that go into making up who I am. But I thought I would start today actually by presenting kind of from a conservative point of view how we understand free speech, or how I understand or was taught about free speech. And it is It's understood as a core constitutional right, as you were talking about, Glenn, and it really protects individuals from government interference. And that's really key in the conservative kind of mindset. We don't want government interference in expressing our beliefs, our opinions, our values, and especially when those might be unpopular, traditional, or religious. And even in that definition, as you were talking about it in from the Constitution, it includes religion there. It includes the peaceable right to assemble, and so there's a context here. So, a definition that might capture that perspective for me personally is that free speech is our fundamental right as individuals to express our thoughts, our beliefs, our opinions without censorship, without punishment by the government, and even and maybe especially when those views challenge prevailing cultural norms or maybe even the majority opinion. So when I think about that kind of statement or definition, there's really emphasis on protection from government overreach. There's also an emphasis on tolerating dissenting or unpopular views, including religious and moral perspectives. There's also a concern that underlies this with a concept or a principle that's come up in recent years, cancel culture, where speech may be suppressed socially or economically rather than by law. And then there's really a skepticism of restrictions on hate speech or misinformation that could be used to silence conservative or traditional viewpoints. Now, that's the hardest one that I have from my multiple perspectives of who I am as a human being to deal with that skepticism of restrictions on hate speech or misinformation, because, and I expect that we actually have some things in common on our concerns on that, because I believe that my personal right to free speech needs to be tempered by a sincere concern for others. Our founding fathers, our nation's founders talked about we all have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if my free speech infringes on your right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, there's a problem there. So I really believe we've got to consider both this challenging directly concept free speech advocacy need with caring for others. And that's where I think we see the differences in interpretation a lot of times between the more conservative and liberal points of view. I don't want to be obnoxiously aggressive, but I also don't want to be ruinously empathetic. And I'm calling on terms here that's actually from a book called Radical Candor by Kim Scott that I've been reading lately. So we'll talk more about this, but I guess where I come down to it, and I know I need to let you chat and talk about this, but where I come down to it is as a communication scholar, I'm also aware of Aristotle's virtues. Now, Aristotle, much before the Constitution, right? A long time before that. But if you apply his virtues to free speech and his virtues, gosh, there are so many of them, and maybe we'll eventually, get into them a little bit more. But the virtues of courage, of temperance, of justice, of prudence, of friendliness, of truthfulness, those kinds of virtues that are things like we learned in kindergarten, right? Things that are caring for others. It's a rich classical framework that really balances our right to speak with the responsibility to speak well, so that free speech is not just seen as a right, but also a moral practice, one that requires us to cultivate virtues that support individual flourishing and communal well-being alongside of our ability to have courageous speech. So virtuous free speech, if there is such a thing, is what I'm after.
You covered a lot of ground there. And I made some notes, so I'll maybe get to them at some point. I don't know if I'll catch everything, but in general, I agree with most everything you said. Uh, one of the key things that I think you talked about was that free speech is intended to protect individual citizens from government intrusion on expressing themselves. Particularly, no one has a problem when everybody agrees with you, right? So, as you said, it's when we have a minority or unpopular opinion or something that goes against the prevailing powers in government. That's when free speech becomes critical. So, I would agree with you there. And you pose that as a conservative slant on free speech. I agree. I don't think that makes me a conservative. I just think we have a very similar view of that at this point. I think one of the things that is important to me is recognizing, and you got at this virtuous. What'd you call virtuous speech?
Virtuous free speech.
Virtuous free speech. Okay, so it's like the free speech is a right, but only with respect, as I understand it, according to the Constitution, when it comes to government interfering with that speech. It's not protected so much when you're in the private sector. So if you're working for a business or a corporation, they have the ability to put limits on your speech. But I totally agree with you that with rights come responsibilities. We've heard that a number of times over the years about different things, and that gets at what you were talking about. The rights we have under the Constitution are legal rights, and they are legally enforceable. You can actually go to a court of law to enforce them. That's important. This is my view anyway, is that the responsibilities of engaging in virtuous free speech, those responsibilities are voluntary, and they're based mainly on modeling, or perhaps in some cases social pressure, and just our own morality. And therein lies one of the problems, is that it allows just about well, not just about anything, but there are some limits we'll get into, but it allows a number of things to come up with as free speech, which legally we can't stop. But when it comes to responsible behavior and responsible free speech, that cannot be legally enforced. That has to be a conscious moral decision on the part of the individual. And one of the things that concerns me is how often it seems that the people who are most vociferous about free speech are the least responsible about how they exercise that speech. And it is especially a problem when you have things that I think are going on in today's society, where there is a lot of modeling by public figures and our leaders at incivil speech. And so we really need to get to a point that I think we had in the past, is modeling more appropriate, virtuous free speech. So that's one of the thoughts I have. In terms of, there was something else you said about, when we talk about speech that goes against the grain, two examples that to me are really important in understanding that. Burning the American flag as a protest, and the protest by the Westboro Baptist Church out of Kansas at venues such as the funerals of veterans. Those, by most people's standards, are abhorrent actions. And yet they have been legally protected as free speech, because free speech is not just actual speech, it's also symbolic use of things like the flag and so on. And it's really tempting to say, no, we need to pass a law to prohibit burning the flag, or we must arrest the Westboro Baptist Church people. As much as I find that distasteful, what happens in those cases, the idea is, and I agree with this, it is a mistake to quickly outlaw objectionable speech, because when you do that, then you have established that the government can limit a wider range of speech. And where do you draw the line between what is legitimate speech and what is illegitimate? And I would hope as a conservative, you would agree with that, we don't want government to be having too heavy a hand in limiting where that line is. So those are some initial thoughts. The other thing I think I would mention briefly, because this hits at something I think is important too, balancing competing principles. So That's why we have limits to that. You don't cry fire in a crowded theater because it endangers public safety and welfare. So there are legal limits, and there are some things we can get into later that are kind of categories of limits. But it's always like with most rights, a balancing act between that right and other rights. And in other words, what is often called, and I've heard David Brooks talk about this a lot, competing goods. That sometimes you have two legitimate interests that compete against each other, so that the more you have of one good, the more it intrudes on the other good. And so it's all about finding that balance. So that's my thoughts for right now. Where do you want to go from there?
Yeah, well, I had a couple of questions for you. And because as I was listening to your examples of the American flag and the Westboro, and you mentioned that government doesn't have the right to arrest those people, right? So I'm wondering who, and I think who is government? Um, and when you're talking about government doesn't have the right to arrest those people or to stop those people, who do you see as the government in those settings?
Well, in that setting, I would assume it would be the local government, local law enforcement. And I would say that they don't necessarily have the right to arrest people just because of their speech and of their protesting, as long as they obey other legal limits. Clearly, there are other legal limits. If they're trespassing on someone's property, then maybe they have the right to be arrested. If they're doing things that are interfering with public safety, like gathering in the road, maybe there's a right there. But the point is that whatever, we have to go with existing legal limits. But if it's just about the speech, then we have to be very careful not to, as a government, intrude on it. And I think it would, in cases like that, be local government. But there's been the reason I mentioned flag burning is because there's been a lot of movement over the years to try to pass laws to stop the burning of the American flag. People find it offensive, and I understand that. But again, as a speech thing, it's you get a package deal. If you decide you're going to make it illegal to do that, then you make a lot of other things legal that are going against the grain, that may be going against the popular view or against the current government in power. And that's not. You got to be very careful with that. I'll say that.
Mm-hmm. The reason I was asking about that is, as you were talking about the Westboro example, I was thinking about early on in my career, an example in which we had some discussion at a university. It's not the current university where I teach, but in another state where I was living at the time, because there was always a preacher person that would come every year around the same time, and they would stand in the public area outside of the student union, and they would basically try to preach a hellfire and damnation to the students. And we as a faculty and the student body, would typically come out and they would heckle them, right? So it wasn't like they were getting. I'm not saying the faculty would heckle, but the student body would sometimes, and sometimes there would be some actual courageous curiosity, I would call it there, that would be there. But we had the administration, who is not government officials, right? They had to decide. There were public safety people on campus. They're not government officials. They had to decide, do I escort this person off campus? Do I allow them to stay? Do I not? And at that point, 20, 25, 30 years ago, they allowed those persons to come to campus. And it was not representing any of the administration's views. So it wasn't seen as people have to believe these things, but they made the choice of, it's free speech. This is a public place in which universities open their doors to have people in a place of learning. So they made the choice to allow that to continue. And although they got some criticism by doing that. So the reason I was asking about who is government, I think there was some thought that the public safety officers or the local officials that should have put that down, or the administration. So it's difficult. It's not easy when you have to
Yeah,
make those decisions, and you get criticized when you bring people in to campus and you have a speaker that maybe is speaking, but to a particular group. In this case, these people were voluntarily coming to campus. They weren't sponsored by a particular group, so they saw it as a different kind of situation.
that reminds me of something I was reading. This is an example, as I understand it, of how free speech has different standards, but depending on whether you're talking about a private citizen on their own, or you're talking about a business corporation, or in this case, higher education institutions. My understanding is that the issue of free speech on college and university campuses is particularly complex, and it's gotten a lot of attention. And there's the distinction between public versus private institutions. The First Amendment more clearly directly applies to public colleges and universities, so that there's fewer abilities by public institutions of higher learning to restrict speech based on its content or viewpoint. But as I understand it, there is also a competing principle that they're there for education, and something that unduly interferes with the ability of the institution to engage in its key reason for being, to provide education to students in a safe environment for that. That's when that can become a concern that might justify having those folks that you describe leave. That's one thought I have.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And since we're on higher education, I'll just bring up a couple of other things that might be something that we take off on, or we might not. But I'm a part of a group called Heterodox Academy that has both faculty and staff and students involved. And it was started actually by Jonathan Haidt, who is not a conservative scholar, but he's written about differences between conservatives and liberals in terms of how they approach the world, and the competing values that they actually do hold that might cause them to have some differences. But this academy was started because they really believe that we need all voices to be heard and valued. So we need to somehow create structures for hearing them. And they really champion the principle that universities should be a place of open inquiry, a place where free speech, where viewpoint diversity is not only protected, but actually actively cultivated. They do a survey annually that's called the Campus Expression Survey, and it's designed to assess the state of free speech and viewpoint diversity and what they call open inquiry on college campuses. They've been doing this since 2019, and it's really measuring whether students feel comfortable expressing their opinions on various topics, which I find is a kind of another component of free speech, certainly that I encounter in higher ed when I'm teaching that listening and civil dialogue class. I really tried hard for the students not to know what my background was, or who I was going to be voting last fall for president, who I was going to be voting for, because I didn't want them to self-censor. I didn't want them to have a fear of academic repercussions. I can't control the social repercussions of people, how they treat each other, except in the class itself. But they're since 2019, they have found that there has been a pretty widespread self-censorship, that students actually are reporting a reluctance to discuss controversial topics like politics, gender, and race. They're fearing those negative consequences, either from peers or faculty, that there's kind of a chilling effect a lot of times on campus, fear of sanctions, that, on open discourse, that it seems like it's a pervasive issue across various types of colleges and universities, not just public, but also private. And so I find it's interesting right now what's going on from the government's perspective of telling universities what it is that they can be doing in terms of like DEI. The government is basically legislating what should be done. Now, I understand from a conservative point of view that some would feel that those DEI initiatives have been forced and that actually that could be part of the chilling effect that might be have happened with students. I don't that campus expression survey is not making that connection in terms of what the causes are, but I struggle at a higher ed level about what is the role of government in telling us what we can and cannot do. And it feels like free speech is under attack again, but this time from the conservative side, where it seems like in the past it's been under attack from the government side of things in this administration, where it seems like it's been under attack in the past. The chilling effect has happened from the liberal side on students because so many, and there's lots of people that comment on this, that most professors, they believe, and there is some data to support this, are liberal in their ideology, which is one of the reasons why the Heterodox Academy was started, because there was a belief that even the conservative professors were being chilled in their speech. So I know there's lots of things to unpack there, Glenn, but I just wanted to bring it up in case that was one direction we wanted to go.
Well, I think it's definitely a direction we want to go. And it's like a lot of these things, when you get into where are the boundaries for our rights constitutionally, it's tough. And people have legitimate points on each side. For instance, the idea that liberals were primarily responsible originally for limiting speakers invited to campus if they had a extreme right-wing view. That's one of the things that was said. It was denying free speech. I think that, I mean, even though I'm liberal, I think that went too far, because I agree that there needs to be, as much as possible, a free expression of ideas, and that it's not good to basically squelch speech and ideas, particularly in a university campus. Well, that's it for the first part of April and Glen's Red Blue conversation. We'll continue this conversation in the next episode, so be sure to check out part 2. And remember that our podcast has dozens of other interviews like this one On the Other Hand, inside your favorite podcast app or on the podcast page at arkansas.braverangels.org.
Thanks for joining us on today's edition of On the Other Hand, the first part of our Red Blue conversation featuring Glen and April on the topic of free speech. On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, Glenn White
and April Chatham Carpenter.
Join us in working to make our relationships and communities better.